It's officially 1 o'clock, so maybe we should kick this off today, guys. What do you think? Are you ready?
Rock and roll.
Okay. So I'm going to get us started. Today, joining us, we have Tracy Shields. He's an RSM living in Colorado that covers much of the Midwest and some of the Pacific Northwest states. We've got Dan Conger, training manager, Chris Wright, VP of sales, myself, Andy Humphrey, RSM for the Northeast. And today we're going to be discussing large retrofit sites. And we've got Tracy joining us because he has a lot of experience in the Colorado and Great Plains Midwest states retrofitting a lot of very large sites. Some are simple, some are complicated. And so today, Dan and Tracy are going to take us and run. And I think with that, Dan, I'll just turn it over to you and you can take us from the top.
Cool. So the concept for today was we wanted to be able to show some of the possibilities with the different tools in the baseline toolbox, right? Because we have lots of capabilities, lots of options, and you're not going to use each product the same way each time. Each time you might use it a different configuration. You might not need this component and need it completely different. So Tracy has 3 different sites he's going to show us. So with that, Tracy, let's bring up your screen and you can share some of the stuff you had prepared for us.
Yeah, Dan. So this first site is in Eaton, Colorado. It's Eaton Rec Center. So it's a baseball, softball, soccer complex, along with some workout facilities and things like that inside. And when Josh called us on this project, he originally came into this project and had two wire controllers. Of which I think each controller had somewhere between 70 and 85 zones on each controller, and had one pump. So we had this complex issue of dealing with flow and having to figure out how we were going to schedule things all the time. Having these 2 controllers overlap each other as they mixed use between baseball, softball, soccer, and regular landscape around the site.
So yeah, let's break that down for a second. So 2 controllers side by side, same water source. So what's happening is controller 1 or controller A is asking for demand, and it may be walking over controller 2, pulling from that same main line. And then what's that end result? It's not pretty, is it?
Right. It just requires for a whole lot of manual forethought and complex scheduling to make sure that one controller is not robbing the hydraulics of the other controller while it's running, which in turn creates some distribution uniformity issues. And
right.
Yeah. What's the design flow of that pump station?
On that pump station, I am not 100% sure off the top of my head, but it's under 200 gallons, 150 to 180 gallons per minute, most likely.
A lot of area to water with that size volume. Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so our solution, this is really quite a simple solution. So our solution on this site was to simply install a base station 3200, which would allow us to take in all of the zones from both controllers, since the 3200 will do 200 zones. And now we put this site into a way more simplistic ratio for flow. So we've got 1 controller to 1 water source.
So one of the key things, the reason that you could do that is they had fewer than 200 zones, which is the zone count capacity, the capability of the base station 3200. So anything under 200 zones, it was going to be really easy to pull it into one. And I got to imagine, were those 2 controllers right next to each other?
They were side by side.
So wiring was probably a slam dunk.
Yeah. We just brought 2 wire paths together into one enclosure into the pedestal, and we're up and running pretty quickly.
So we'll talk about the flow management in just a moment, but that certainly had to simplify their scheduling, right?
Oh yeah. So you were able to take down to 1 water source, so no longer are you having to manually guess what can run. We could put this controller into flow manage and prioritize athletics over regular landscape, and even prioritize baseball over soccer if we wanted to.
So Tracy, was there existing schedule something like controller A runs on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and controller B runs on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday? Or they
somewhat, they did have some overlapping days. with the sports turf. This slide's not really representative of the quality out there now that Baseline has been out there for probably around 24 months now, and with Josh out there, all these fields are logoed and in prime condition, so he's taken this place quite a ways.
Well, when we spoke earlier, you had mentioned the priority over the playing surfaces, right? So we got the 4-ball fields and the sports turf. So that park, is it a park or a school that's adjacent to it? That park adjacent to it, that if they took priority over the ball fields, that's probably why the park is, how should we put it, less than optimal. Doesn't look great in this picture.
Yeah.
So we're making turf quality choices based off of their watering capabilities.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think it's a good time to just kind of briefly mention the capabilities of the Base Station 3200. The key thing here is that the controller can handle 200 zones. So you were able to pull in those under 200 zones into a single controller. That was wonderful. And then those 8 water sources. So we're only doing 1 water source right now, but the controller can do another 7 water sources. So definitely we're just barely scratching the surface of what this controller can do, but it was plenty, right? It solved their problem. And that was the main thing, right? Is they had this issue and you solved it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Let's take a look at this next site, which is quite a bit more complex. So this is a park in a suburb of Denver, Colorado, in the city of Westminster. This is their city park, and this is an old Maxicom site that had 17 controller locations, independent of each other, and 1 pump station. So 17 controllers and 1 water source.
What? Time out. Wait, we had 2 controllers and 1 water source. That's an issue. Now I've got 17 controllers and 1 water source. That got exponentially worse, didn't it?
Yes. Yeah. So it presents some serious issues with scheduling flow, right? Where the old system could potentially handle all of this flow, but is very cumbersome in programming and scheduling. It takes a lot of work to do this. Site, I believe they ended up leaving in somewhat of a standalone mode. So they were actually managing 17 independent controllers just to irrigate this one facility. So yeah,
you don't even have 17 days a week. So you can't even say controller 1 is Monday, controller 2 is Tuesday. You don't have that option. That's any water manager knows that's a brutal situation to be in.
It's a full-time job for a person to manage that.
No doubt.
Yeah, so our solution here, Dan, was to break things down into sections. We needed to stay under 200 zones per controller, so we introduced 3 3200 controllers, and then we introduced some of our 5200 PCK powered bicoders. And the way we did that was we grouped things. So in this yellow grouping, we had our 3200, and we had an existing 2-wire communication path between controllers. So we were able to use the 5200 PCK boards to replace controllers. So we just extended the terminal strips out along a 2-wire path that existed.
And Tracy, that existing wire, that comes from the old Maxicom infrastructure?
It did, yes.
So when we were talking earlier, it's like, how did they know that they could use that Maxicom wire? Where'd that idea come from?
So that just went back to some experience that I've had in the industry. I've been out in the field doing central control for somewhere around 20 years of my career now, and just knowing how our technology works and being able to see what their problems are, and then find a bundled solution to come back and present the most economical way to retrofit the site. So that just came from knowing what was going on in the field and being able to make a recommendation to the customer that, hey, let's do this.
Wonderful. That's great.
In a good number of those sites, Dan, the original Rainbird pedestals are still there. So we took the faceplate and the terminal strips out, and you used the transformer that was existing and just laid our 5200 powered bicoder into the top of the pedestal.
So left the stainless steel pedestal.
I'm sure there's somebody that's online watching this asking the question, what the hell's a PCK board?
Coming up. So, I'll give you a preview of the PCK board. So here is an example of an powered bicoder, which is a version of a PCK board. It's how we address conventional wire out in the field. And so what Tracy did is he brought 2-wire into this and then was able to connect to the existing conventional wire that was out there.
Yeah, so that if you hold that up one more time, Dan, for those that can see, there's a red and black indicator on the right-hand side of our screen looking at you. That's the 2-wire connection. So that device is a 2-wire device. You could call it a conversion. It converts conventionally wired valves into a 2-wire addressable terminal.
Which is why it's called a PCK, pedestal conversion kit.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, see?
I learned something today.
Good to have me out.
Thank you for all you do. So you did it. The yellow grouping was essentially yellow grouping was all connected with wire back to that base station 3200, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And then the next section here on the right, the purple section, we'll call it, we put in a 3200 and utilized the existing 2-wire path of communication and brought these controllers on to one 3200. So we now had 2 3200 controllers on the site. And then we've got this one in the center of the map here, the green controller, and we had some 2-wire communication path integrity issues here. So we were unable to use that leg of the 2-wire path. So we popped in a 3200 that here will end up connecting with a substation just a little bit off site in the upper left-hand corner of this project. So we ended up with 3 3200s down to 1 pump station now.
So that means if it's 3 3200 base station 3200s, and each one could have a maximum of 200 zones, this grouping has to be under 600 zones, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So now you've got it down to 3 controllers from 17, which is outstanding, right? It makes management so much easier, but we still have that same challenge of multiple controllers and 1 water source. How'd you address that?
So that's when we introduced the flow station. So the flow station allows us to manage multiple controllers across multiple main lines.
Okay.
So that allowed us to introduce this flow station, and now the flow station simply becomes the boss of all things flow.
Tracy, how were so controllers yellow, green, and purple? How were those communicating to the flow station or to each other?
Yeah, so we brought them in through Ethernet radio network
Cool.
and cellular technology.
Cool. Create a local area network.
Yes.
So we brought up, so let's briefly talk about the flow station, right? So this is as Tracy alluded to, it's a flow manager, flow management controller that the programming's still sitting on the base station 3200. So the water windows, the flow, all the programming and the time resides there, but this is only, or not only, but it's managing everything related to flow. Now, the flow station is far more capable than we have in this scenario, so we can get into really complex situations with up to 20 water sources and 40 main lines. So you didn't have that on the site, but still it was able to manage that flow. So if the green controller had a high demand that couldn't be met, it would know, the flow station would know how much it could allocate out to it.
Yep.
And then you also mentioned that you used a radio network for the flow station. What were the other choices that you had on flow station for communication methods?
We could have used cellular modem or Wi-Fi.
Okay, so pretty much
bring it
lots
into
of
the
choices.
same network.
Okay. So the other thing that we brought up in this section was the powered bicoders or the 5200 boards. There's a couple of different names for it because we have lots of different configurations, lots of different ways this can fit together. But the short of it is this is how we can update your conventional wire in the field to 2-wire technology back on the controller, right? So leave that wire in the ground, but still have 2-wire technology on the board, all the way up to 48 zone groupings until you need a second cabinet. But this is why we have those different names, right? Is it can fit in our cabinet, it can fit in our controller, but as you did on your site, you could retrofit them into their pedestal. So all sorts of different configurations. Maybe we've got one of these that's mounting into your metal cabinet. Maybe it's just this board connecting out of the controller. So.
Yeah, Dan, if you think back probably 4 weeks now, maybe even 5, when we were talking about the Boston Public Garden and that retrofit, and if you remember the illustration or the picture where we put 144 zones, I believe, in a stainless steel, which is just those boards stacked on top of each other.
Wow.
With a
That's
few
great.
extra transformers.
Yeah.
Bad stacks.
So this is probably a good time to remind you, if you got any questions, throw them in the Q&A. We'll make sure we answer them before we wrap up today. So,
Well, let's talk about one more site here, Dan. So this next site is a project down in Colorado Springs. It's an old Rainmaster Eagle site, and presented some issues for us. We had 11 controllers and 5 water sources. So you see the groupings of yellow squares, those represent our controllers. So we've got a couple groupings there where we've got 4 controllers onto one main line.
wow. And are they really right next to each other like that?
Yes, so those groupings of 4 were actually stacked into the double-sided strong box. So there's 2 controllers on both sides back to back. So 4 controllers in a single box. And if you hold to the end here, we'll show you some serious irrigation eye candy images.
So they had separate water sources and separate main lines, but if you gave me a choice to go out and program the controllers, I'd pick the ones on the right side of the screen and not the ones on the left side of the screen, because those with the quads, that had to be just almost as bad.
Yeah, serious chore to have to program that.
Yeah.
Seriously complex thought processes, probably spreadsheets, lots and lots of notebook paper and trial and error to get things to work correctly. So our solution here was to come in, and we installed a brand new 3200 up there in the upper right corner of the image. That was a brand new area of landscape that was getting added into this section of the neighborhood. So this is just a small section of this neighborhood too. So it's nowhere all inclusive to this neighborhood, but this was the project and the solution for this parkway in the neighborhood. So that 3200 came in, and then out at the quad plexus of those 4 controllers, we put in substations. So each one of those 4 plexes got a single substation, and then they got 3 5200 PCK powered bicoders. And then about the center of the map on top was just a single substation and a pedestal there. So we were able to broadcast out with Ethernet radio and communicate with those substations. And then we used a piece of 2-wire to connect to the 5200 boards.
So then to clarify, then you went from what, it was 11 controllers?
Yeah.
11 controllers. You got it down to 1. So it's under 200 zones on this entire, everything we see on the screen.
Yeah.
So we got to, wow. Okay. That's a wonderful thing. 1 controller, but then you brought in multiple water sources. So we'll have to take a look at that in a second. So then you mentioned that base station 3200 needs to communicate with the substation. And how was that again?
So that was through Ethernet radio.
Okay. So you used a wireless
solution.
Okay. And then in the cases where we had those powered bicoders or the 5200s, they appear to be right next to the controller, and you used a short piece of wire there?
Yeah, short piece of 2-wire to connect those boards back to the substation.
Okay.
That's awesome. 1 controller and 2 different types of performance components to pull them all together.
Yeah.
And all the while accommodating 5 water sources, or 4 water sources. 4, 5,
Yeah.
5 in the lower right
Yeah,
corner.
I think it's 5, right? 500. So, okay. Well, then, so we now this kind of comes back to the base station 3200 capability. Earlier I'd mentioned it can handle 8 water sources. Well, now one base station 3200 is handling 5 water sources. Still could add in more complexity, and it could still handle it on one single controller.
Mm-hmm.
So we haven't heard about the substation yet. So I'll bring that up. So the substation is that extension arm of a base station 3200, right? We're bringing in sensors and zones and master valves all back into the base station 3200, which is the controller. This is an extension. But we have the capability of adding up to 8 substations onto one network of a 3200. And we can get up to 100 zones on each one. But here was the critical thing is you had it under 200 zones in this grouping, right? That was critical.
Yeah.
If when it exceeds 200 zones, you're going to use another controller.
Another 3200.
So anytime you're under 200 zones, this is a great way. As Chris brought up, right? You used a substation to do a wireless extension and not trench wire, and you used wire where you could because it was cheaper and easier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah, so let's take a look at what this site looked like, kind of a before and after. So this was one side of, on the left here, one side of a quadplex, right? So the backside of this enclosure included 2 more controllers that looked really similar to this, and the wiring that went into that thing, and then the upgraded version of that is on the right-hand side.
Because I think I'm going to be a little sick to my stomach. That on the left is pretty awful.
Yeah, pretty rough. Yeah, and the 2 guys. We'll look at one more picture here. But the 2 guys that wired this and set this up really deserve a lot of credit. Spencer Jordan at BBC and Bob Wilshire with the developer out there at Wolf Ranch spent a lot of time in agonizingly separating all of this wire and bringing it all back into something that ended up looking like this inside of the cabinets.
That is just beautiful.
Nice.
That is just beautiful.
Isn't that amazing?
We need more of that in our life, don't we?
Yeah,
back up a slide.
Makes it a lot of fun.
Yeah. Would you back up one? I had a question for you.
Sure.
More of this and less of that. Now on this, the controller on the right with the 2 substations, this is the first time I noticed that dark gray. Is that some sort of a channeling or for routing wire?
Just some Panduit wire channel. So it's got a plastic cover over it, and so you got the substation up on the top, and the 5200 X cabinet right below it, and then you've got a mirror of this on the back side because this is a double-sided opening strongbox. So it looks like this on both sides.
Wow. Okay. And then this is all communicating back to a single base station 3200.
Correct.
So what was their final zone count for that base station 3200? Was it right at 200?
Off the top of my head, I'm not quite sure. We're pushing right up to 200 zones. I think it's well into the 190s.
You're trying to figure out how to get the last. Do hydraulically? Do we really need this?
Tight. Yeah, very tight.
Been there before. Yeah. Awesome. That's great. So shout out to those installers. That's beautiful and great way to bring those products together and kind of make them all stick.
All right,
Mr. Wright, got any questions for Tracy or for us?
We do. Kind of back to the single water source where we've got 3200 in a substation configuration. The question is, how does the run soak cycle operate with the multiple components? And you have to calculate the start times at each base station to take in account the soak times.
So in a single, I think this might be a couple of us answering this one. Andy, I've got an answer. I want to see, Andy, what your answer is.
The thing that I would point out, if it's not already sort of assumed, but the substation, those become zones of the controller. Okay, so if you have 24 zones in your 3200, you have 24 zones in your substation, you now have 48 zones on your controller. So the way you want to think of it is, now I have a 48 zone system. How do I want to program this 48 zone system? And the way that either the wired connection to the PCK board or wireless to the substation works is it's all real time. So you could have a zone running on the substation or the PCK board and a zone running on the controller at the same time, but the controller just considers those sub-zones as zones of the controller, and the soak cycle works just as if they were all on board on one controller.
Correct.
Exactly where I was going with that. Yeah.
Yeah. So the substation's just an extension of the operating power of the 3200. Yeah.
Yeah. It doesn't know if it's connected to a substation or if it's connected to a powered bicoder or if it's connected right to the board.
Yep. They're just remote zones of the controller.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. All right. Another question is, how many zones can this run concurrently? So with each transformer, you can run on 2-wire. You can run 15 zones concurrently if you've got enough water to facilitate that. So if you've got base station 3200 and a substation, you would be able to run 15 zones at a time on each component. So that's 30 zones at one time. So the 3200 can operate up to 99 zones concurrently in its programming. However, we're limited to 15 solenoids per transformer, per performance component or controller.
And I think this may add one layer of complexity, but on the retrofit boards, those boards can only output, I believe it's two zones per terminal board. So on a 48 zone controller, you could run 8, right? 2 per 12, I think.
Correct.
Yep.
That's accurate.
So 2-wire and conventional are slightly different, but it's all about hitting that 15 concurrent per transformer or being limited to 2 per retrofit board.
And I always bring up that it's always more than one, better than one. And as Chris brought up, each transformer, we get a whole nother go around.
Yeah. Great questions.
Nice.
Definitely.
Anybody else want to chime in while we have another 2 minutes and 30 seconds left?
But who's counting?
Okay. Well, feel free to chime in here while we wrap up. Dan, what do we have on the docket for next week?
Next week, we're going to talk about control point technology and how you can use that to help manage your system and the components that it brings in. So flow, pressure, and master valve control and where that fits in. So it kind of sounds a little bit like a point of connection, real different from a point of connection.
Yep. So we'll be talking about perhaps some submains, automated isolation valves, things like that.
Right. We'll look at it from simple perspectives and then to larger complex sites and how it fits into all of those.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Any other closing notes, guys, before we wrap up episode number 8?
Negative. Thanks to Tracy for joining us as a guest speaker today.
We appreciate you.
Have you on this episode, Tracy.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thanks, everyone. Appreciate you joining us today, and we'll see you next week.